I would say that I got interested in architecture as a consequence of being interested in art. And architecture began to emerge as this really interesting thing. And so I became an architect because I love to draw. And I just liked this idea that I could draw every single day as a possible profession. And it actually was somewhat prophetic in that it all kind of worked out.
My story's a little bit different. I like to draw, but I really prefer making. And so I've always loved Legos, blocks, kind of the classic architect story of liking to make things as a kid. My uncle is also an architect, Robert Taylor, here in Houston. And I remember as a kid, going to his office and just being fascinated by how he could draw such a straight line, and his writing was impeccable. And the prospect of being able to go to a place and make every day, kind of like Alan's getting to draw every day, was kind of an epiphany to me in terms of what was possible. Robert is the one that actually convinced me to come to Rice, basically set me on my whole trajectory, as I became a professional in architecture.
If I only worked on the adaptive reuse of old structures for my entire career, I would be happy. There was something about having to find the underlying logic of a structure. And for us, that speaks to research and the things we learn about buildings and going back to the original idea. But once we determine what the logic is, then revealing that is sometimes more about subtraction than addition. And that the Space Needle was absolutely true of that we definitely deleted before we started to add on.
The Seattle Space Needle, an architecturally daring structure, imaginative, beautiful. From its inception, it was destined to become world famous.
The Space Needle is kind of in a class of its own. I mean, it is the defining icon of the city, and it's certainly one that Seattleites feel like they collectively own. It's a very precious building for Seattleites.
It wasn't supposed to be a building or a remodel. It was supposed to be a website. And the agency kept saying, you guys need an architectural specialist on this project. And they were like, what do we need that for? We don't need an architect. I had a number of ideas about, I thought, how it could invigorate the visitor experience. And I just pitched them, even though nobody was asking for them. And Karen Olson, who was the sort of head of marketing at the time, and she said, we were just checking off that box. We were not going to hire an architect. But after that conversation, we actually thought we should sort of dig in and actually see, if we were to do something architecturally, what would happen? Fast forward 6 years later, $100 million remodel, and the most significant sort of plan for the structure and the building for the next 50 years.
The building was landmarked in '99, and basically at that point, that becomes the landmark. So even though they did many additions and modifications from 1962 to '99, those all become part of the historic fabric. And so even though there were things that certainly the original designers did not want, a cage, for example, around the observation deck, that was a landmarked piece we had to negotiate removing. And so that got into this kind of political territory where what was the right thing to do, by the letter of the landmarks regulations versus what the original designers probably, we know, wanted to do. And that's when it kind of got a little bit more nuanced, I think, with the political implications, I guess.
The Space Needle is actually privately owned, and in the early days, some of our concepts were being generated. And there would be websites that would say, people write anything in a comment, and so they would say, well, this is a waste of taxpayer money. But there was no taxpayer money. It was all privately funded, and so it actually wasn't. None of the sort of the public resources were actually used on this particular project. But there, you can imagine that, if you're going to change an icon of a city, when you look at photographs, part of the study they did that was so interesting, they showed people photographs of Seattle, and they had photoshopped out the Space Needle. 8% of the people around the world that saw this recognized the city's skyline. They then showed them the photo with the Space Needle in it, and 78% of the people recognized it. So it gives you a sense of the role that identity plays in terms of the architecture and understanding of, and recognition of cities. The only other city more recognizable was Paris, and it's only if the Eiffel Tower was in the image. So these observation buildings sort of have that sort of message.
You can do the greatest space, but if there's not somebody to activate it, what's the point? And so that was a big lesson, and good partners in that sense.